Okay. Must have sat on it. Well, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. May Jesus, would you bless these words and these thoughts that they would honor you and unite us in faith. Hihani washte mitakoyapi. Good morning, my relatives. First, I'd like to tell you how wonderful it is to be back here again. And second, I'd like to introduce myself properly. My name is Lenore Three Stars, and I'm Oglala Lakota, which you may have learned in school to call Sioux Indian. I was born in the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, where my father, Peter Three Stars, was born. And my mother, Frida, is also a Lakota, but she's from the Minikoju band. There's 7 bands of us. And so she's from the Cheyenne River Reservation, which is also in South Dakota. Traditionally, our culture is matrilineal, but things changed when we were colonized by the Western Europeans, who later became known as Americans. And true to their patriarchal ways of organizing Indian people, they enrolled me on my dad's reservation instead of on my mother's. So in Lakota culture, it's proper to introduce yourself in a kinship manner because our family system, our Tioshbaye system, is the foundation of our way of life. And that's why I always take time to introduce myself this way. Indigenous protocol also leads me to acknowledge that the land that we're on today was originally ancestral homelands for a host tribe. And I say host tribe because hospitality is culturally ingrained. So the host tribe in this area would have been the Duwamish, and it's proper for me to ask their permission to teach on their land. So are there any descendants from the Duwamish tribe here today? Okay, well then I go ahead and I give my respect to the people, the Duwamish people and their homelands. Now I call you Mitakuyapi because the Lakota philosophy of life is Mitakuyapi Oyasi, which means we are all related. We're related to each other and we're related to all creation, human and non-human creation. And that's how we should treat each other, as relatives in a kinship manner. So when I say I'm Lakota, I'm more accurately saying I'm a relative. Like the Hebrews, I come from an oral tradition. When we are given a story, and it's a gift, it's for a good reason. Stories are a way to preserve wisdom and to pass on cultural values, including humor. I know that the stereotypical way of looking at Indians is pretty serious. You know, we have the stoicism and the noble facade, but under that is some pretty crazy Indian humor that has seen us through some dark centuries. So I bring a native perspective to what I say and do, and I do have a sense of humor under here. Now, stories from the past are to be learned and lived today. Usually they're very old, and they're told and they're retold. And one of the most precious stories in my family is about my great Unchi, my great-grandmother. Jenny in the lead is how her name translates out. She survived the massacre at Wounded Knee by fleeing on horseback with her baby on her back. And I can hear my mom's voice say that baby would have been my uncle, but he was killed by a soldier's bullet. Unchi endured unimaginable dehumanization, but she went on to raise a second family. I have a picture of her holding my grandfather as a baby. And as I stop and I look at that picture often, and I'm so impressed by her courage and her perseverance. When I'm discouraged, it gives me strength to look at that and to know that DNA with an ancestral memory like that lives within me. And as I look around the room, I sense that there's that same kind of strength here that comes from ancestral memories of women who had the courage to endure. They may be hidden figures to the world, but from generation to generation, their stories live in you. In the same way, I believe that the Samaritan woman's story was told and retold. It was spoken before it was written, and I can imagine a storyteller weaving words of action and imagery and wisdom. She might have said, "It was a hot and dusty, dry day. She did not want to go to the well in that heat, but she had to. Her heart was in her throat when she saw that Jew sitting by the well. Oh, she could tell he wasn't going to ignore her. He was going to say something to her, and her heart was in her throat." I think that writing down the story can take away some of that power, can tame that message. But still, what we read today in John 4, I think it's still pretty powerful when we know the context of that story. Because what do they say? That without context is just pretext for proof text. So the Samaritan woman's story is in the biblical canon for a reason. What is it about her story? What does it offer us to learn and live today? As an overview, the book of John was written after the synoptic gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The message of John is meant to affirm the divinity of Jesus, God incarnated. It emphasizes that in the beginning was Jesus, and through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that was made. So for us, Jesus is creator. Then for a purpose, creator Jesus became flesh and moved into the neighborhood, like the message would say, fully human, yet fully divine, the eternal triune God. John describes 8 miracles. In between some miraculous healing and some miraculous feeding is the story of the Samaritan woman. And the uber miracle in John, of course, is the resurrection of Jesus, to prove to us that his message of love and sacrifice is real and life-giving. Now, as I read the Samaritan woman's story, I have to say right off that I identify with her. She's a brown ethnic woman like me who comes from a culture of suffering. She's Samaritan, so she knows what a racial slur feels like, especially half-breed, for Samaritans are not full-bloods. They were not regarded as pure Jews, and the pure Jews looked down on the Samaritans. Shows how old the story of racism is. Samaritans were a mix of Assyrian foreigners who moved in and intermarried with the Jews who were left behind after the 10 tribes were deported. The king of Samaria at the same time imported people in from places in his empire, along with their religions. So the idea was that they would intermarry and assimilate and break down any cultural and national loyalty. That's the same policy that was applied to natives here in this country. It was an ideology that was born in the doctrine of discovery, and it evolved into manifest destiny in this country. And it was very intentional. In fact, the U.S. government imposes a blood quantum requirement on natives in this country to certify how much Indian blood they have. It's called a DIB, degree of Indian blood. My son and I have those pieces of paper to show how much Indian we are. The government came up with an arbitrary fractionated formula that they wrote down for us. So it's like a pedigree for a dog. Now, no one else is concerned with what my blood quantum is, but it matters to the government because they made treaties with tribes in this country, with sovereign nations, and that means they have legal obligations to live up to. The government received peace and land and natural resources, and we received some land reserved to us, our reservations, and lots of promises for what we needed in the necessities of life just to survive. So hundreds of treaties were made, but not one was kept. Reservation lands have been whittled away by Congress, which is how you abrogate a treaty, as they found that they needed more land for Western extraction and as they discovered more natural resources on the lands that were reserved for us. That's why my tribe, the Lakota Nation, does not have the Black Hills anymore. The Black Hills are our sacred land. That's where our creation story comes from. That's where our people still do their ceremonies at certain times of the year. But now there's a biker bar down the road because the government took it back. Custer's people found gold there, and so we had to let it go. The idea is that through this intermarriage, our degree of Indian blood will diminish until the government no longer has to recognize us as treaty Indians, and they have no more legal obligations to us. When that happens, the genocide will be complete. No other ethnic group in this country has to live up to a blood quantum requirement because no other group has land and natural resources that can be taken. So racism and greed, very old stories. Oh, the Samaritans were despised because of their impure bloodlines. And further, their religion was an anathema to the Jews. It turns out that in Samaria, this new population that came in had a problem with killer lions. And so they concluded that this was because they had not properly honored the gods in that country. And so the king of Assyria sent back a Jewish priest to teach them the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of Moses. And I find it so interesting that they found killer lions to be a spiritual problem. There's all this racism and greed, but it's the killer lions that are the spiritual problem. So the result of this was a corrupt mix of Judaism and idolatry, another reason for the pure Jews to despise and look down on the Samaritans. And the Samaritans didn't worship with the Jews in Jerusalem, in the temple. They worshipped in Mount Gerizim in their own area. And as if there weren't enough reasons, the Samaritans also sabotaged the efforts of Nehemiah to rebuild the walls, and they opened up their country to welcome fleeing criminals from Judea. So I think we have a pretty good picture of the bad race relations between the Jews and the Samaritans. Their kinship system was totally broken. So yes, the Samaritan woman came from a culture of suffering in many ways, culturally and spiritually, definitely. And given her personal context, I would not be surprised to learn that she also suffered emotionally and physically in her many domestic relationships. She must have once been a young Samaritan woman looking forward to that fulfillment, that culturally fulfilling role of becoming a mother and having a home. That's a common Jewish motif. But the text is silent on whether she was denied even that. What if she suffered the cultural shame of being barren? 5 broken marriages, and now she's not even living with a husband. Circumstances at some point began pushing her to the margins of society. Eventually, by the time we meet her, to the outermost margins. We don't meet her by name, though she's just the Samaritan woman. We know the stories of many women in the Bible who are referred to by their names: Ruth, Esther, Dorcas, Martha, and about 7 Marys. However, some are not named. The Canaanite woman. They're hidden figures, but they're only hidden to the world. Their stories reveal the truth that Creator sees you. By design, we are Imago Dei, the image of God. And when Creator sees you, that's what he sees. You are good. So the women in the Bible who are referred to only by their ethnicity, like the Canaanite woman, that relates to this story in the sense of how women were treated in that culture as property. Now, I went online and I watched Becca, and she did a super job of unpacking that story. So I'm not going to say anything else except for that Jesus intentionally went into the Gentile lands in order to have a transformational conversation with the Canaanite woman and to heal her daughter. It was a divine appointment scheduled by Creator. In the Samaritan woman's story, Jesus intentionally went straight into a land that Jews normally avoid, Samaria, to have a transformational conversation with the Samaritan woman and to heal her broken and battered spirit. So we read, and if you want to open up to John 4, that would be fine. So on that day, Jesus was waiting at Jacob's well for their appointed time. He and his disciples had come from Judea in the south, and they were walking north to Galilee. And the shortest route was to go straight through Samaria. But usually, to show their contempt for the Samaritans, Jews would, instead of going straight, they'd take this really long route just to avoid it. Jesus, however, had that appointment that he wanted to keep with the Samaritan woman, even though she didn't know it. So we read that the disciples left Jesus to go find food. And here comes the Samaritan woman making her way to the well at noon in the dusty, dry heat of the day, instead of at a cooler time when the other women went, like in the morning or in the evening. But she was not looking for a social interaction. She was looking to avoid a snub. She knew that she had a reputation that made her a social outcast in her own community. I can't imagine what she must have thought when she saw a male Jew sitting at the well where she was headed. Now, the story often references Jacob's well. And to me, that symbolizes the historical connection that their people had through their common ancestors of Joseph and Jacob. But now it was just a silent witness to their broken relationship. She probably stopped short. She saw, what was he doing at the well? I got a mind picture of how did she know that this was a pure Jew? But I got a mind picture of sitting on, a struggling, dusty, dry reservation, and here comes a man, obviously from a privileged position in white society, and he's expecting, deferential treatment and a favor. And so I think, oh, okay, now I think I get the picture of what she was thinking. And I'm thinking, she was probably in a bad mood anyway, because once more she's picking up that water pot to make her way out to the well in the hottest part of the day. So when Jesus asks her for a drink of water, she was shocked. Shocked that he spoke to her, because Jews don't speak to women, and they certainly don't speak to fallen Samaritan women. Jews don't ask Samaritans for a favor, and they do not share utensils with Samaritans, because who knows if they follow the proper purity laws. So this Jew-Samaritan dynamic surely put her at a disadvantage, to say the least. And I just wonder if she thought, oh boy, here it comes. How many times in her life has she endured racist treatment? How deep was the hole in her soul from being less than her whole life? Had she already begun to internalize the oppression so that she began to believe that maybe she was less than? All of this is what Jesus knew he was walking into. This is why he intentionally wanted to have this transformational conversation. And I'm not saying it was an easy conversation. As they talked, her vulnerability was exposed. You've had 5 husbands, and the man you're living with isn't even your husband. She couldn't deny it. She tried to deflect it. Oh, you don't like where we worship. But what is our general response? Do we wonder, is there something wrong with her that she can't make a marriage last? And now she doesn't even care if she's married anymore. As the truth of her life was revealed, it might seem like the Samaritan woman had given up on life. But I sense a deep well of strength in her. She may have had that protective shell of bitterness around her heart, but her will to live was still there. She had that little flicker of hope, which I think is characteristic of women as life bearers, as life nurturers, as life sustainers. This conversation would be transformational because Jesus meant to heal her bruised and battered spirit, to create new life in her spirit. One of my aunts is a therapist, and she has worked with Native trauma victims for a long time. And she says that when we are traumatized by a pattern of violence, our spirit leaves our body because of the trauma. She understands that we need to be treated holistically. Our whole self is broken after a pattern of violence, not just our body or not just our mind. You can't compartmentalize your healing. In hard times, we need each other. We need our community. We need our ceremonies. Our kinship system is designed so that nobody is alone. None of us are meant to process hard times all by ourselves. My aunt would say that it's our kinship role to create a sense of safety, to help that person so the traumatized spirit can return to the body. Then she says, we can stand in full spirit. Well, you've heard about the upside-down kingdom that Jesus brought when he said radical things like, the first shall be last, and love your enemies. In fact, Jesus announced his ministry by saying, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, and to let the oppressed go free. And the Message translation says, to set the burdened and the battered free. So at first, the Samaritan woman saw Jesus as part of the dominant oppressing class because he was a pure Jew, the ones who used their power and their position and their authority to justify and to institutionalize their bigoted treatment of the Samaritans. But she would learn that Jesus was actually modeling his ministry vision of preaching the gospel, liberating, healing, setting the burdened and the battered free. I see Jesus modeling resistance, too, against the dominant power, the Pharisees. What he did was countercultural. His love for the Samaritan woman gave her dignity. He took this hidden woman on the outermost margins, and he moves her to the center of the story. The world saw her and looked down at her, but Jesus doesn't see as the world sees. He knew her inside and out. He knew everything she had done, everything that had been done to her, and that she had a broken spirit. But what did he see in her? Imago Dei, a beloved maid in his own image. When you know that's what Jesus sees in you, how can you be more? Not how can you want more, but how could you ever be more? So Jesus took the conversation to an even deeper level when he offered her water. There is a water theme here that would resonate in indigenous cultures around the world. Women have a special and distinct relationship to water, which is rooted in cultural beliefs and social practices, and even in an economic context in terms of sustainability and quality of water. In Lakota, we say Mani Wachoni, and that means water is life. Water is our first home. We're born in water, and water is our first medicine. Literally, many indigenous healing practices include taking certain amounts of water at certain times. So Jesus offered this Samaritan woman living water, a fountain of endless life, and she responded with faith. Her response was the kind of faith that Jesus said he was looking for. Worship in spirit and truth. Engage yourself in the pursuit of truth. Simply and honestly be yourself. For he knew that a time was coming when even the temple in Jerusalem and Mount Gerizim would be laid desolate. Worshippers would need to practice everywhere. And he told her how. Do it out of your very being, your spirit, your true self. Well, she could do that now. She had received his gift. The Samaritan woman was healed in spirit. And how long had it been since she could stand in full spirit? Her spirit was full, and she couldn't help but tell her community, even the community that had let her down, that stopped treating her like a relative. She called to them and pointed to Jesus, and they responded with faith, proclaiming him to be the Savior of the world. He took a whole community on the margins of a Jewish society and moved it to the center, all restored in their kinship system. So to close, at the beginning of this, I asked, what is it about the Samaritan woman's story? What does it offer us from the past to learn and live today? You will all process this and find your own answers, but here's one that is found in Acts 1:8. But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. That's our responsibility to respond to. Blessed be the name of the Lord and the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Amen.